Thanks very much, Attorney. Sounds like we can all just pack up and go home.
Haven't got it yet.
Yeah. But while we're all still here, we do have... we are going to have a wonderful conversation this evening with our panellists about what a Human Rights Act is, why we need one, and how we should go about getting one. I'd like to introduce you to our panellists. Rob Hulls is the former Attorney General of Victoria. Rob is currently the Director of the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT in Melbourne. Rob has been described as the champion and architect of the Victorian Charter of Rights. The Australian recently reported that Rob believes that this state needs a Charter of Rights so every Queenslander experiences justice as a reality. Karen Walsh is a tireless advocate for the rights of women, children and disadvantaged and marginalised groups, including homeless people. Karen is the CEO of Micah Projects, which is a not-for-profit organisation in Brisbane. Karen has been an influencer in the not-for-profit sector in Queensland for over 35 years, including as the president of QCOS, a board member of ACOS, and as a founding and active member of the Australian Common Grounds Alliance. Shane Duffy is a descendant of the Kalkadoon people from Mount Isa in northwest Queensland. Shane has demonstrated his commitment to social justice and human rights for Australia's First Peoples in the human services sector for over 25 years. Shane is currently the CEO of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service. He has recently returned from the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, where he was involved in facilitating a side event on justice reinvestment. Kevin Cox AM is a highly respected human rights and disabilities advocate. Kevin is currently Queensland's Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, an appointment that he's held since February 2011. Kevin's work promoting and protecting the human rights of people with disability has been recognised through an Australian Human Rights Medal in 2005, an AM in 2010, and continually in the words and thoughts of people with disability, their friends, family and supporters. Let's give it up for our panellists. So Rob, as the architect and champion of the Charter in Victoria, perhaps you can explain for us Queenslanders, what exactly is this Human Rights Act thing?
Well, after listening to the Attorney General, I might move back to Queensland. I do find it extraordinary that somebody who worked with an Aboriginal legal service in Mount Isa all those years ago with Shane's brother, after the Gelpi-Peterson regime and the horrible legislation that was passed under that regime to impinge upon people's rights, that I'm back here in Queensland supporting a charter for human rights in this state, and it looks like it's inevitable, which is fantastic. Look, that's what it is. That's the document. Pretty simple. It's an act of parliament. It can be changed. It can be altered. It can be added to. It can be reviewed. It's a simple act of parliament that sets out the relationship between the state and the citizens that the state serves, and it sets out rights that need to be taken into account whenever any piece of legislation is introduced, and rights that need to be taken into account whenever any action of government departments is undertaken. And you know, it's a no-brainer really, some of the rights. I mean, for those who oppose a Charter of Human Rights, they have to explain why it is they don't want enshrined in legislation the right of freedom of movement, the right of freedom from forced work, the right of freedom of expression, the right of peaceful assembly, property rights, the rights of children in criminal trial process, the right to a fair trial. I mean, these are basic rights that need to be enshrined to change the culture of government. It's important, in my view, that the ghosts of the past in Queensland don't reappear. And the best way to protect the rights of Queenslanders for all time is to have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities.
Yeah, so I guess then we think, okay, this sounds all great, but really, Queensland, do we need a Human Rights Act? Do we really have human rights issues in Queensland? Karen, I'd like to hear from you, and Shane, I'd also like to hear from you on this. In your work, have you come across situations where a Human Rights Act, would have improved things for people?
I'll take you out a running order, sis.
Okay.
First of all, I acknowledge country, the other Turrbal people, members of Parliament, other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room, and all of you as people who are committed to advancing, to moving towards a Human Rights Act in Queensland. So forgive me, I didn't want to miss any points, so I will, as the Attorney, read off this. So, as the CEO of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service in Queensland and the chairperson for our national body, I work with some of the most disadvantaged and marginalised Australians. So during my time with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service, I've come across numerous situations of human rights abuses which have brought home to me the need for stronger human rights protections. One example that I want to quote was a case example from Western Australia. So in 2005, one of our members of the National in Western Australia represented a 15-year-old Aboriginal boy from a place called Onslow. He was shipped nearly 2,000 kilometres to a juvenile detention centre and spent 2 weeks in custody after having been refused bail by police and then in turn justice of the peace. His crime, attempting to steal an ice cream worth $2.30. Might I add that this young person had never been in contact with the police or the correctional system ever. I wanted to bring then it to a local sense in relation to Queensland. So in 2013, and these things happen every day, the human rights abuses. But in 2013, one of my lawyers represented a young deaf woman who was charged with a serious violent offence. Her case was extreme. She had developed delays due to a complex of mental health and language difficulties. She did not speak, but understood Auslan. Her own speech was a form of home signing, a personal hybrid language she and only her family really understood, and even then, only to an extent. So some of the issues my lawyer had in representing this client included the unavailability of interpreters, and that still continues within our court systems today, the lack of understanding of the court about the extent of the language barrier present, the lack of properly skilled, qualified mental health practitioners within the mental health court and arrest courts, the lack of treatment options and the difficulty in moulding court orders to facilitate bail conditions supportive of treatment as opposed to simply preventative detention. Furthermore, when this client was taken into custody due to her mental health, she was placed in a high-need 24-hour watch facility where she could only be visited once by her family, once by her lawyer and support person, an interpreter, and she did not have any meaningful access to an interpreter so she could communicate with the correctional facility staff. She faced the same issues when she was detained in hospital. Only after years of lobbying by the client's mother, including to the Attorney General, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, Disability and Race Discrimination Commissioner, as well as federal politicians, was the situation improved. Why does it take so much of an effort to address the human rights of an individual? So if time had come to provide many more examples of pointless, cruel and unnecessary poor treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the justice system. It's obvious to me that the rights that exist in the Victoria Charter of Human Rights, such as the right in children, in the criminal process and the rights in criminal proceedings, will be an important guarantee for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their interactions with the justice system. We need strong legal protections to improve the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly when it comes to the justice system. Might I also just add in relation to, I presume that's that question, is around public policy. What I see day in and day out is public policy being misinterpreted and bastardised, depending on the individual that's reading that policy. What I'd recommend to the Queensland Government and acknowledge to the Attorney that we're looking at legislative reform. I want to particularly acknowledge the harsh process that you're undertaking in relation to DV. Enough is enough. No more domestic violence should impact upon our women and our children. But let's look at the legislation that also needs to be looked at, not only around the domestic violence, the mental health. Why is it that people sit in custody for up to 18 months waiting for a mental health report to be provided to the court when the legislation states 21 days? I talked about justice reinvestment. we've discussed it with the government, we need to look at a justice reinvestment framework. Not only does it make economic sense, it makes perfect sense from a human rights framework as well.
Kevin, thanks. Shane, thanks for that. I think those stories were really powerful, not just because they demonstrated the individual human rights issues that Queenslanders are facing, but also the systemic failures. And really that's, and you've made that comment, that what a Human Rights Act actually does is prevent human rights issues from happening. So potentially the service providers that those people are coming into contact with would have acted differently had there been a Human Rights Act in place.